Are you passionate about foreign policy, national security, and the latest in domestic politics? Consider becoming a member of the DSR Network, your go-to source for in-depth analysis and insightful discussions. With the DSR Network podcasts, stay ahead of the curve on global affairs. Each episode features top experts, policymakers, and thought leaders who break down complex issues into digestible, engaging conversations. From breaking news to historical context, we cover the topics that matter most. Whether it's the intricacies of international diplomacy, the latest in national security strategies, or the dynamics of U.S. politics, the DSR Network has you covered. Members receive an ad-free listening experience, bonus content for virtually all of our shows, an invitation to join the DSR Slack community, enhanced show notes for select podcasts, and much more. Visit thedsrnetwork.com/buy and enter code GRADUATE to receive 30% off the regular membership price for the first year or first month. That's thedsrnetwork.com/buy and code GRADUATE. Thank you very much for your support.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. Politico is reporting that some Republicans are worried about Donald Trump's reaction to his criminal conviction in Manhattan. They say Trump is overly focused on using the verdict to lather up his base and should be more concerned about the likelihood that it could alienate swing voters. We think this gets at something essential about Trump and the MAGA movement itself, that Trump and MAGA leaders cannot accept the very idea that their Trump-centric obsessions might be off-putting to swing voters. Seeing these obsessions as a political liability is impossible for MAGA. To help sort through all these pathologies, today we're talking to Washington Post reporter Isaac Arnsdorf, author of a new book called Finish What We Started, The MAGA Movement's Ground War on Democracy. Isaac, great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
First, let's talk about what some of these Republicans are saying. At a rally in Arizona on Thursday, Trump obsessed over the conviction, raging that an appeals court should reverse it. That led Barrett Marson, a GOP strategist in Arizona, to suggest Trump should give moderate right-leaning independents a bit more reason to vote for him. Meanwhile, John Watson, a former GOP chair in Georgia, suggested that Trump should pivot to issues voters care more about. And Congressman Don Bacon said Trump needs to focus more on the 10% of voters who haven't made up their minds. Isaac, do you think there's any chance Trump will stop obsessing over his conviction this way?
Well, he's still obsessing over the impeachments and the Mueller report. And so, no, I mean, this is front and center in his mind. He's expressing genuine outrage. There's a interesting dynamic going on between him and his followers where, you know, obviously what Trump is experiencing is unique in American history and maybe in modern human history. But there's actually something very relatable about it for his supporters. The alienation that he feels, the sense of this isn't the America I know. How can this be happening in my country? And that they actually identify very strongly with that. So the messages that in the book, I call it a feedback loop of pushing each other to become more extreme. So, you know, he's getting those confirmatory feedback from a lot of his supporters, and he's going to be more inclined to be receptive to that than outside advisors who are asking him to do something different.
That's really interesting. I mean, your book beautifully brings out this dynamic that I really find so bizarre, which is that for Trump and a certain type of MAGA leader like Steve Bannon, this kind of worrying about what swing voters think is understood almost as a form of weakness. For them, Trump's legal mess isn't a thing to get swing voters to forget. It's the central event. It's the central crime of the current political order. Similarly, Trump losing the 2020 election is being redefined by MAGA as a stolen election to position it as another great crime against Trump and his voters. Can you talk about what the MAGA movement really believes, kind of along these lines, that they're just sort of the victim of this immense series of crimes that never seems to end?
Yeah, I mean, Trump is very much running because of this, not in spite of this. This being the prosecution and in a broader sense, the claim of the stolen election. That unquestionably helped him win the primary. And so, they're not, he and his campaign are not totally off base, and other Republicans when they expect a boomerang effect that would actually help him. Of course, we're dealing with a very different electorate in the general than we did with the primary. But one of the key findings from the reporting for my book is that the roots of MAGA, the roots of what became the stolen election myth, really run much deeper in the American conservative movement. It really goes back to the dawn of the modern conservative movement with Barry Goldwater, and a fundamental premise being that America is a conservative country, no matter what the election results are, right? If the election results indicate otherwise, then it's the election results are wrong, because it's just postulated that America has to be a right of center country, and the question is making the results align with that fundamental belief. And so, from there, if you start with that premise, then you see how you get to delegitimizing outcomes to the contrary, such as the election of Obama through the birtherism conspiracy theory, or the election of Biden through the stolen election myth.
It's really interesting. I mean, what you kind of see you see this kind of through line where what used to be center-right nation, this view that the United States is a center-right nation, is now becoming the United States is MAGA nation, right? I mean, it really is a hallmark of Trump and MAGA dogma that the country is, on some fundamental level and in a majoritarian way, MAGA, right?
Right, and that's really what changed over time. So this ideology, this movement existed, but was systematically marginalized by the Republican Party. I mean, Goldwater lost in a landslide, and the Republican Party kept that fringe at bay. And if you compare Trump to Pat Buchanan, a lot of the ideology and the presentation is similar, but Buchanan got 10 or 15% support versus Trump getting 45 to almost 50% support. That's a reflection of Trump's charisma and talent as a politician and ability to popularize and mainstream something that was a fringe view into making it a Republican consensus view. And, so again, starting with that premise, Steve Bannon talked to me about how he actually agrees with the interpretation of Republican losses in 2020 and 2022 as being the fault of traditional Republicans who aren't on board with MAGA. But his response to that is not trying to win them back. His response to that is, forget about them. We're going to go and find all these MAGA voters who don't know they're MAGA yet. Maybe they are, traditional, non-college educated white Democrats. Maybe they are people who don't vote at all. They're going to go after that high-hanging fruit rather than trying to worry about putting back together the Republican coalition that had been working that fractured with Trump.
We saw what happened in 2022. They lost across the board. And your book has some great reporting on how elite Democrats concluded that the idea of MAGA is a political liability for swing voters. Early in 2022, their polling and focus groups showed, you reported, that voters were very aware of what MAGA is and that they understood MAGA as shorthand for Trump's racism and attacks on democracy and the rule of law. And so it's just sort of fascinating that Bannon is entirely unrepentant here. Can you talk about what those Democrats concluded and what it means?
Yeah, if you go back to 2021 and early 2022, the Democratic conventional wisdom was basically, don't talk about January 6th. Don't talk about Republican extremism. It was too abstract for regular voters to care about. It was an inside the Beltway concern. And a research project that was conducted by Cap Action and some other groups leading up to the midterms found that actually a majority of voters identified with the idea that the Republican Party had changed and had become more extreme in a bad way. And that was a useful wedge because it peeled off moderate Republicans from MAGA Republicans and kind of gave them a way to be comfortable with voting for Democrats, even though they didn't want to be considered Democrats. And it was that term MAGA that kind of unlocked this, that the researchers thought ahead of time. They kind of figured people wouldn't know what MAGA was. It sounded like Baby Babel or like an Israeli political party or something. But that actually it was very high name recognition for MAGA and bad associations. And the beauty of it for their purposes was that it was already in the vocabulary. The MAGA Republicans were using it to describe themselves, and it connoted all of those negative aspects, but without the loaded, charged terms that would that would potentially antagonize moderate Republicans if Democrats used it. And so you saw how they really leaned into that in the midterms, and that's become core to Biden's and the Democrats' messaging in this election. Almost every Biden and Democratic statement is under this rubric of MAGA extremism.
What's interesting to me about this is that there's something intrinsic to the MAGA movement that doesn't allow Trump and MAGA leaders to acknowledge what you're saying. They can't acknowledge that MAGA and Trump's obsessions might be a liability to swing voters, right? I mean, this is partly kind of a hallmark of autocratic authoritarian politicians to constantly try to strike fear into the opposition by treating their total defeat as inevitable, by treating themselves as overwhelmingly strong and it's futile to resist and so forth. I mean, Trump does this regularly. He says he's winning overwhelmingly in polls, whereas he's really only very narrowly ahead. His enemies are always on the run and losing. His crowd sizes are always dramatically inflated. They're enormous. Can you talk about how this form of politics works in the context of the MAGA movement? A lot of this is really an inability on the part of the MAGA worldview to acknowledge what you're saying about its liabilities with the broader electorate, right?
Yeah, I mean, another way of thinking about it is, like an expression of shaping reality, right? That being a form of Trump exerting power, of being able to shape reality in the way that he says, and historically that is an important element of how nationalist movements communicate. And again, historically, when they falter is when that gap between the reality that they're trying to impose and the reality that people actually experience widens so much that it no longer becomes tenable. I mean, kind of a classic example is the effect of the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster on the Soviet Union.
In your book, you report on Steve Bannon's vision of total victory for MAGA. Bannon, for listeners, was just ordered to surrender to prison after getting convicted for defying a January 6th committee subpoena. And he just told the New York Times that, of course, he was never going to cooperate with the committee. He's proud of not cooperating. Screw Nancy Pelosi and so forth, right? And what I read from that is that would entail, in other words, cooperating with the January 6th committee, acknowledging error now, that would entail acknowledging the legitimacy of current liberal democratic structures, whereas Bannon wants to destroy them completely, right? I mean, that's the core of MAGA, is that that the current system and the current order and the current regime, the word they use constantly, is fundamentally illegitimate, right?
Right. And what you see now is a very close and disturbing parallel between the delegitimizing of the election system in 2020 to what is now the delegitimizing of the law enforcement system, of the criminal justice system, through the conviction of Trump and Bannon and Peter Navarro and the prosecutions of January 6th rioters.
Yeah, and I think that actually is one reason smarter Republicans are worried, right? Because in the wake of Trump's conviction, Republicans know that they're going to be required to use the House of Representatives to somehow derail ongoing federal prosecutions of Trump. And Axios is reporting that some moderate Republicans are worried about having to vote on one of these initiatives. Like the last thing a marginal Republican in a district that Biden won in 2020 wants to vote on is something that would essentially place Trump beyond the law. I mean, isn't Trump's obsession with his conviction as a result of this going to lead him to demand that House Republicans carry through their efforts to protect him from prosecution? And won't that keep his criminal travails in the news?
His criminal travails are going to be in the news. I mean, I think it's still too soon to say what the impact of the conviction is on the small slice of voters who are going to make the difference. But I think one thing we can say for sure just in the past few weeks is Trump is going to keep talking about this, and like we talked about at the beginning, but also Biden is going to keep talking about this. And that is a little bit more surprising, actually, because the White House and the Biden campaign were taking the approach throughout the trial and throughout the indictments of staying away from this, right? Because they didn't want to do anything that would be seen as lending credence to Trump's accusations, which lack evidence, that this is all a centrally coordinated White House-driven political persecution. But that changed once there was a conviction, once there was a jury verdict. And you're seeing the Biden campaign talk about this all the time now, in part because it drives Trump to talk about it instead of talking about things that voters care about more, but also because, look, it's as much as Republicans want to spin how this is going to boomerang and this is going to drive support for Trump. He certainly doesn't like being a felon. No one wants to be a felon. And if you ask them candidly which outcome they would have preferred, there's no way that they would have chosen conviction.
Oh, of course. I mean, the reason that they keep saying over and over that Trump's conviction is going to be a positive for him is just to sort of seduce the media into repeating it.
Look, I mean, I know I have talked to Republicans voters who say that. I talked to a guy last week who I talked to him last fall, and he said, I'm leaning Trump, but if he gets convicted, that's a red line for me. And so I called him back now that it happened to see what he thought. And his view actually was very interesting when you have these voter conversations, because he said, based on what he knew about this case, he didn't think that really counted. So he wasn't ruling out Trump for that reason. But at the same time, given everything that he was considering on policy and rhetoric, he was leaning less toward Trump than before and was very interested to watch the debate coming up later this month.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. I mean, I think the smarter Democrats understand what you're talking about in your book, the reporting you did. They understand that there's a thing out there that you might call an anti-MAGA majority. I think, Simon Rosenberg coined that phrase for it. And talking about the convictions and really keeping the focus on the convictions reminds people what they don't like about Trump and MAGA. And I think that there really is a genuine debate among Democrats about how far to go with this. But in my view, the ones who really grasp that the anti-MAGA sentiment is a thing that matters in our politics are the ones who have it right. And that's why it makes sense, I think, to talk about the convictions and keep the focus on them. What do you think, Isaac?
Yeah, I think that framing as an anti-MAGA majority is interesting because it, another one of the things that I learned from reporting the book was this slice of Republicans who are, it's very core to their identity of being Republicans. And it's very hard for them to think about voting for Democrats. They're not going to become Democrats. And the way that Democrats and anti-Trump Republican strategists have learned to to talk to that group and to draw them out and to form kind of a mini community around those voters. I think we often in daily journalism discount those Republicans because they are a vanishingly small minority. And the Trump campaign and Trump supporters are very good at messaging like, well, they don't count. Anyone who criticizes Trump is like automatically not a Republican anymore. But in a close election, that's a game of inches. We saw how decisive that voting bloc was in the midterms, and they very well could be decisive again in November.
Yeah, and a lot of money is going into reaching that very small slice of voters. We should add Sarah Longwell, the Republican pollsters group, the Never Trumpers, who are really kind of putting real resources into trying to reach those voters and so forth. I think a Liz Cheney endorsement of Biden, which I think will probably happen. I wouldn't bet my life on it, but it seems likely that will happen. As far as I know, George Conway, I interviewed him recently, and he said he had understood straight from Liz that she sees the choice as a binary one. And George Conway, expects Liz Cheney to endorse Biden in a high-profile way at some point. I think this is why Republicans are actually nervous. And it's really interesting to me that you describe it as spin, the discounting of that slice of voters, because that's exactly what it is. The Republicans who are not spinning, the ones who understand the situation, they think Biden's weak, and Biden is weak. And I think he's trailing narrowly right now, but they understand that there's a major liability on the Republican ticket in the form of Trump and MAGA when it comes to losing that slice of voters. And it is spin when they say that those voters don't count.
Right, but it's also, it's delicate, right? Because Sarah Longwell described it to me as needing to acknowledge for these Republicans that it is a real tension and it is a real struggle. And, I think some of the sensitivity on the Biden campaign about looking too active in trying to court Republicans to endorse him is, you don't want to make them look like Democrats, right? You don't want to make them look like arms of the Biden campaign. You want to kind of, for them to be credible messengers for that key slice of Republican voters, they want to preserve their independence. They want to preserve their Republican identity. And so, there's a way in which having Mike Pence say he won't vote for Trump, but not going all the way to endorsing Biden, lets Mike Pence be actually maybe more effective.
Yeah, that is fascinating. It's almost like you have to let that slice of voters get to supporting Biden on their own, right? Isn't that what you're saying?
Right. Again, it's that, treating them as a distinct group of voters with a distinct struggle, rather than, just trying to talk to them like Democrats, which they aren't.
I want to close out by returning to the sort of conception of total victory that Steve Bannon and other leading MAGA-lights have, and your book reports on so well. Everybody should check out Isaac's book. It's, I think, maybe the most focused on the MAGA movement as opposed to on Trump himself of all the books out there. And the thing about the MAGA movement, this conception of total victory, I think it very, very consciously involves winning without acknowledging the legitimacy of the justice system, winning the election without ever admitting error around January 6th, winning the election without ever saying, true, Biden won the election. The final triumph is to either capture those Republican voters who are alienated by this stuff and break their wills and get them to side with MAGA on these big Trumpy obsessions, right? Or to win without them. Isn't that right? Isn't that the end goal? Isn't this what Steve Bannon has in mind? Isn't this the total victory conception they have?
Yeah, I think the hardest part of the book conceptually is that a second Trump term, by his own definition, would very clearly be an authoritarian agenda and an authoritarian presidency. And you can get an undemocratic outcome like that through a democratic process. In fact, historically, that's most often how it's happened, not through military, but at the hands of elected leaders. And the book really struggles with kind of that paradox of dismantling democracy through democracy, but also why that's appealing to people, why millions of Americans would actually desire that outcome.
We have to hope that group isn't too big, Isaac, because I don't know what happens to our democracy if it's bigger than we all expect. Isaac Arnsdorf, thank you so much for coming on with all these cheery thoughts.
I promise it's more fun than it sounds.
It absolutely is. I guarantee it, folks. Thanks again, Isaac. Everybody, we have some good content up for you at TNR.com. Check out Matt Ford on the right's truly bizarre and incredible argument for weakening consumer safety, and Grace Seegers outlining how Republican governors are refusing free meals for millions of kids. We'll see you all tomorrow. You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler on the DSR Network.